Computer is working. Okay, it's nice when the computer works. How's everyone doing this afternoon, evening-ish? Good. Ready to break our brains on some Mishnah? All right, so we rammed through a little bit more of 8.1 or 8.1, chapter 8, Mishnah 1 last week. So we're going to pick up on chapter 8, Mishnah 2 this week, page 71, if you're using the printout that I've got. Again, these are the translations put together by the United Synagogue for Conservative Judaism. One of their greatest accomplishments was this full translation and commentary on the entire Mishnah, and it's one of those accomplishments that most people have never heard of, which is a real shame, because there aren't that many straight commentaries of the Mishnah, and there really weren't when it was first brought out. Now there are a few more that have come to published, but this was out, and this is, of course, free, which is an amazing gift to the Jewish world. So 8.2, we are continuing our property discussions, and we're going to continue these discussions for a while. It goes on into chapter 9, where we get more questions of how can a woman retain ownership of her property based off the negotiations before the marriage takes place. But for chapter 8, we're going to mostly continue to deal with this sort of the standard cases. Well, we're going to deal with cases which come without additional statements of requirement or restrictions and things like that. They're not going to be standard in all senses, but these are ones without additional conditions placed upon them. We good? Everyone found the right page? Okay, as our style, I'll begin to my left. If you would like to read out loud, great. If not, just pass it to the person to your left, and we'll keep going till we find a reader.
So Rabbi Shimon distinguishes between one kind of property and another. A, property that is known to the husband, the wife, not sell, and if he has sold it or given it away, her act is void.
I'll go ahead and do part B because it's a natural contrast.
And property which is unknown to the husband, he may not sell. And if
she may not sell.
Oh, she, that's right. Bifold is fixed. But if she has sold it or given it away, her act is legally valid.
So you may remember we had our little timeline up here that there was this window between the betrothal and the marriage where the woman was still technically in control of her property, but the husband also had a certain, shall we say, expectation of what she was bringing to the marriage, and whether she could or couldn't sell it, and if she could, whether there was any recourse for the husband to go after the purchaser and say, hey, you have to return this, was the argument of chapter 8.1. Rabbi Shimon is saying, yes, but that restriction only applies to property the husband is aware of. So if he knows that she owns an orchard, then the orchard is subject to all that back and forth of can she, can't she? Can she, can't she? But if he doesn't know about the orchard, they are getting married, and as far as he knows, she's coming with no orchard, then she is still allowed to dispose of the orchard however she feels like, because what he with the property.
People didn't did you read about that, the questionnaire about properties before wedding?
So, yes and no.
Because if I was a husband, I would send you a questionnaire or send an auditor to check really, so I know exactly what's going on.
Right. I want to see your last 3 years of tax returns, right?
But in a different way, like, or knowing someone that knows the family, asking questions, right. So, making investigation. Remember,
when we were in chapter 7, we talked about the idea that if there was a bathhouse, then any physical defects would already be known because someone would have seen her naked in the bath and would have reported to him whether there was any defects. And that means after married, he has no right to come back and complain that he didn't know. So the question is, financially, would there also be this expectation of full disclosure? Full disclosure was not demanded by halakha. Whether the husband demanded it would have been another matter, and whether the wife and her family would have demanded it is also another matter. So I personally think it is a good idea before you marry someone to do a little bit of a background check on the person beyond what you've learned about them, and to even do a title search. Make sure there are no outstanding loans, debts, properties that are attached to their name that you don't know about, that once you get married, you will be liable for. That's in the modern American legal system. So yes, I think that is an excellent recommendation, and spoken like a good real estate agent, that you should check a little bit of the history on these things. But it isn't a requirement of the halacha. So it is still very possible that they would get married and neither would truly understand the full assets of the other person before they begin merging their households together after the wedding. And Rabbi Shimon is talking about that kind of situation where you've gone into the betrothal, you don't really know what's going on. She has an orchard, she's about to move to maybe a new city or something, and she has to decide, well, can I sell the orchard or do I have to worry about my future husband complaining about it? He's saying, look, if he doesn't know about the orchard, he can't complain about it. But everyone does still agree that if she goes ahead and sells it, even though he knew about it, technically it is still a legally valid sale because it isn't under his sphere of influence yet. Does that make sense?
I thought if he knew about it, it wasn't valid.
No, it is valid.
But she did give away her idea.
What he's saying in part B is that what we call lechatchila, from the outset, she shouldn't sell it if he already knows about it.
Right.
But b'deavad, to use the technical term, after she has done it, there is no legal remedy against it. It still is upheld.
Says property known to the husband, the wife may not sell, and if she does, it is void.
Are you reading the same?
The first
It's the
one.
introduction.
Oh, the known one. Right.
The known one.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I was flipping the two. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly right. Yes.
It's very confusing.
Yes.
In fact, I probably should have read property is known to the husband. Stop. The wife may not sell.
Right. Yes. So his argument is that it would be void, but that was a matter of debate in the first Mishnah that we were dealing with. Rabbi Shimon has his own third opinion. Technically, in my opinion, Rabbi Shimon should have been part of 8.1 to continue the arguments about these topics, but for whatever reason, the editor of the Mishnah decided to make it its own entry. Okay, complicated enough? Okay, let's continue the complication. Now she is married, right? So we're on to 8.3. She is married now, and now some new money comes into the equation. Aaron, if you're ready.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. If a married woman came into possession of money, land should be bought with the money, and the husband is entitled to the
Usufruct,
usufruct.
right? Or another word for usufruct that's more common in modern English would be dividends, right? The what is paid out from the investment, but not the capital of the investment itself. So what this is talking about, and we'll do sort of another little timeline here, right? We actually had a marriage, a wedding take place, and then somewhere along here, she gets a load of cash, right? Maybe a relative, maybe a friend, somebody gives her 100 shekels. And the question is, what happens to those 100 shekels, dollars, gold coins, whatever you want to call it? And according to the beginning part of this Mishnah, this money stays hers, technically, but since her husband is allowed to enjoy the dividends of her property, we need to turn the money into something that will make dividends. Now, in the modern world, people would think of, I'll loan the money, right? And then I'll get interest on it. Well, that kind of loan and interest, of course, is not legal under Jewish law. The bank kind of things that we do now are more complicated financial instruments, which maybe some other day we'll talk about.
Welcome to a non-Jews.
Well, so
Jewish law to give, for example, a loan to other religions.
So
Ask for interest.
right, so the laws of loans and interest get rather complicated, but by default, we generally did not make loans in this time period that the Mishnah was being written. So the question is, how do you turn this into a dividend-making item? And the idea is you convert it to land. You need to learn how to hold this new pen because it's very sharp on one side. You need to convert it to land. And the land is still hers, but the fruit, right? The fruit is his. So every year when there's a harvest, he sells the fruit. That money goes into the household pocketbook, but the title to the land would still remain her property. So that way, the dividends are still being put into the family pool, which is under his control at this time period in history. But the actual property of the land, the actual ownership of the property and the value of the land remains entirely hers. Make sense? Okay, now the big issue here, and one that we might still take issue with in the modern world, is she's not really being given the choice to just keep the $100 in her bag, right? That $100, that money, needs to be turned into a financially productive object in order that it will produce for the family.
Because she's part of a team now.
She is part of the team. Yes. And since, as we've talked about a few different times, but it's still always have to keep repeating it, since under the economic structure of 2,000 years ago, when it was all a mostly land-based agrarian society, since that land was passed down by patrilineal inheritance, father to son were for dividing the land. Therefore, the head of the team was the person who was in charge of the land by ownership, by inheritance. And that meant that the husband was the person who had the ultimate authority to figure out what to do with the land.
So what if she just wants to sell it?
So that is going to be a debate within the family. If she wants to just sell it, once she's married, she can't just sell it without her husband's permission. If she does get his permission and she sells it, then the money would still stay hers, and they can negotiate that. Again, probably saying this every week for a while, because there's a lot of these complicated topics where it also can be socially awkward in the modern world. There's nothing stopping the family from working out a different arrangement. This is, he said, hey, I saw you got $100 from your aunt. Buy an orchard so I can enjoy the produce, right? So that I can sell that. If she says no, technically he can go to court and force it to happen. If she says yes, no problem. If she says, well, actually, I'd like to put it in a bank account for our kids' college, not that they had college back then, but you get the idea. And he says, okay, that's okay too. If she says, well, actually, let's keep the money just in case, there's a bandit attack, and then we have something that we can run with and, be able to survive, and he agrees, that's also fine. So they can come up with their own arrangement. This is the legal minimum if they can't agree of what can be forced to be done to resolve this situation.
So since they did something that's so conservative, because today you said it would be some kind of investment, can she object based on the investment being too risky?
She can't object in this particular system, but you will notice, and that is a very good comparison. He can't take her $100 and go down to the racetrack and invest it on the horse and say, number 4 in the third race, to win. So he's not allowed to buy wine and then have it be shipped overseas and hope that it's going to make a profit. They have to buy something that is stable and with a known value. So yeah.
She's still the owner of the land.
Exactly. This value of the land is still her property. And so he's not allowed to just be wild with it against her wishes. Again, if they both agree this is fine, yes, whatever, they can agree to whatever they want to agree. But if he tries to say, hey, there was this guy I met at the bus station, he had a great idea. Give me that money that you just got from your aunt, and we're going to double it in a week. And she's like, what are you, crazy? No. Then it's land, right? Always go for land, real estate, right? That's what they say.
No, what happens if at the time of currency, like if she passes away, because the land is under her name, not his, so still is like any other arrangement, like the rest of the family, or can she pick someone else to keep the land?
Technically, if he is still alive, and we're going to see a lot more of this topic in chapter 9, but technically, if he's still alive, he is the primary heir to his wife, right? So if a wife dies, her husband will inherit from her. So that is the default. There are more variations of what could be done, but the default is he inherits from her.
And if he's not more alive, can she pick to whom? Maybe pick to someone else and not the natural. She doesn't want.
So again, the default is always that it would go then to her children, would be the heirs from if he has died. But a person does have more options before they die to arrange special what we would now call a will, a special way to arrange their funds that isn't by default. But the default does go to the children, yes.
In this case, wouldn't the land go to the children and he still collects the use effect?
Nope.
No, he gets the land.
He inherits her property if she dies before him. And yes, that's the making of a wonderful murder mystery. As long as she's dead, I can use it. And then I can go talk to that guy at the bus stop again. Okay, so that was one sentence.
If she came into possession of produce that was detached from the ground, the land should be bought, and the husband is entitled to the use of it.
All right, if this sounds very similar, it's because it is. But this time, instead of it being $100, it is 100 apples. But let's imagine apples are worth a lot more than they are now. So she gets a bunch of produce. It's already, a bundle of whatever. Maybe her family had a great year on the fig farm, and they decided to send her a huge wagon full of figs. What happens with it? Well, you sell the figs, but you don't just take the money and then go on a cruise. You sell the figs, you take that money, and you buy land. And once again, the produce of the land will be his, but the actual value of the land remains hers. Fairly simple, right? See, second sentence was much easier. Third.
If it was produce attached to the ground, Rabbi Meir says the land is to be valued as to how much it is worth with the produce and how much without the produce, and with the difference, the land should be bought and the husband is entitled to the use of it.
Oh. Sorry. These are our sound installers.
I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. The projector,
It doesn't work as it is.
do you want to take it down?
Oh,
We're gonna clean up all the other stuff.
that'd be great. Yeah,
It may take us a couple of days to get it out of here, but we'll take it out and get rid of it for you.
that'd be great.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that thing's about 80 years old.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that. We're trying to bring us into the 21st century, and that takes time. Where was it? Oh, yes, the produce. Well, it's all about produce. So here we've got a more novel situation. Actually, hold on. I got new markers today. I can do this in color. So she is given not the orchard, not the apples, but the apples in the orchard. Meaning to say, the fruit on the tree is being given to her as property. Right? That is the unusual situation that we are in. And I think if there's any more modern example. I can't think of anything that is quite comparable in the modern world. Maybe you can have the first puppy of the litter, but the babies aren't even born yet. Right? So it is unrealized potential. It is still attached. What's that?
Royalties, would that be comparable?
I'm not sure how royalties fit. I mean, it's similar. That's good creative thinking that royalties are like fruit as yet unproduced, but we know it's going to produce. That's an interesting comparison. I'm not sure how royalties are handled under Jewish law, but that would be a good start. I've never had to worry about it. So yes, the idea here is that the fruit is still attached to the ground. When they say attached to the ground, they mean attached to whatever source of growing there is. And this would not be unusual. Well, I mean, this is not bizarre, let's put it that way. Meaning that someone could say, I'm giving to you the right to pick all the apples in that orchard, and they're your property. Right? But anything you don't pick will remain my property. So you have free run to pick all the apples you want, and I'll keep the rest. So now she owns the unpicked apples and will gather them. Make sense? Okay, so what Rabbi Meir is saying is, well, how do you figure out what this is? He says, it's simple. You take and you say, well, there are 10 trees with 10 apples each. And so you figure out what the land costs. You figure out what the land would cost if there were no apples. And you take the difference, right? Land with apples is 110. Land with no apples is 100. Therefore, it's valued at 10. Very nice. You take the 10, you buy land. The husband can then use the dividends, just like back here. Does that make sense? Okay. However, the sages, the Hachamim.
So what happens if the money is not enough to buy a land? What is the second default?
So there are ways of going in piecemeal on land. So you didn't have to always buy like 100 acres. Sometimes you could just buy like a share of land. And you didn't have to buy like a massive quantity.
What if it's not enough?
I mean, like you got 5 pennies?
Like actually $100.
Like
Something very small.
like timeshare.
You can.
Like a timeshare.
What is the minimum amount?
Hey, there was an American cereal company that gave away real pieces of land in the Yukon in Canada. That was 1-inch size pieces of land. This was a serious thing back in the 50s. Not serious, it was for kids. But so you're going to get small pieces of land. But so what would happen, I imagine, would be that the land would have, the money would have to be just sort of held as kind of a trust if it wasn't enough to buy anything at all. Again, you can't just spend it because without permission, because it is technically her money, her worth, her value. But if you can't turn it into usable property, then you can't, right? Or let's imagine you're in a place where you're not allowed to buy land, right? You live in many of the parts of Europe during the Middle Ages where Jews were, it was illegal for Jews to own land in many places. So then you would just have to hold on to the money or come up with a family agreement of what could be done with it.
And who will be in charge of recording the money? The husband, or you will charge to someone else, a third person?
I think it would be the husband but if he's untrustworthy, meaning if he goes and spends it or whatever, then she has the right to claim that back from him. So, he would have to be trustworthy or else it would be an obligation for him to make good on it.
That middle age thing, because he's entitled to the use of that. So if he can't buy land, should he be entitled to put in something else that returns dividends?
So you could come to an agreement, and I'm sure that they could negotiate it with whoever their local rabbi was, because you can't just say carte blanche, sure, a reasonable dividend. What counts as reasonable? What counts as risky? What counts as something that would be the equivalent of land in a different time or place? So for example, in the modern world, if someone came to me with this kind of situation, I might say, well, look, if you can't come to an agreement, put it into some sort of saving bond or a CD fund or something like that. That is FDIC insured. You're not going to have to worry about it going, back to zero. You're definitely going to at least keep the principal, and whatever dividend, whatever interest there is, would be available for the husband/family. That would seem to me to be a reasonable modern equivalent. But it would really depend upon the locale and what could be done.
Yeah, some of those CDs are like less than 2%.
Yeah, well, how much do you think of a return of investment you're going to get for apples?
At least 5 to 10.
So you think that like the value of like the orange groves around here, that they make 5 to 10% of the value of the land every year in oranges? So like if you own an orange grove, like within 5 to 20 years, you would get or 10 to 20 years, you'd get the money back for having purchased the land. I don't know. I think the land is probably worth more than that.
That's why they are selling the land to developers.
Exactly. So I don't think the oranges pay that high of a rate of return, but that just may be the modern world, or it may be because of the value of orange groves in downtown Orlando now. You're much better off putting an apartment building there for the value. But we digress. The sages, on the other hand, we didn't do part A, did we? Right.
The sages say produce attached to the ground belongs to the husband and produce detached from it belongs to the wife. With the proceeds from the latter, land should be bought and the husband is entitled to the use of it.
All right. So the second half, which is if it's detached, it belongs to her. That's just like part 2 up above. But the first half is basically the sages saying, look, if it's still attached to the trees, then technically it's dividend. It is usufruct, right? If it's still growing, then that is the produce we were talking about. And so that's technically his property, and he can dispose of it however he thinks is best for the family. If you want it to go to the woman, pick the fruit first and give her the fruit, and then the value is hers. But if you're giving it to her attached, then he will automatically enjoy 100% of it because it is still dividend on the tree. Make sense?
What a complicated life you guys have 2,000 years ago.
Yes, which is a very good point. So, I mean, first of all, life today is just as complicated And if anyone has ever seen or knows somebody who's gone through a complicated divorce, this is nothing compared to what happens in the modern world. And also, of course, in the modern world, people can sometimes just be good-natured and deal with it very nicely and civilly. But yes, life has been complicated for a very, very long time. Right? We're not the first people to invent, this idea of dividends and capital and all of that. We have more complicated ways of doing this with, very fancy instruments and stock markets and all of that. But they had all those basic concepts. They didn't have some of the infrastructure. They certainly didn't have the communication tools that we have to make it more advanced. But they had all the basic ideas that we did. And their life was just as complicated as us, and they were just as smart as us. They lacked a lot of information that we have now. Thank God we have it now. Yay, we can get rid of diseases and things. But the basic human mind has not gotten smarter significantly over the centuries. It's just gotten more informed. So never scoff at people of antiquity. They were brilliant, and they did things that most of us would find very difficult to do if we had to do it on our own. I'm glad I live in the 21st century.
Did any other peoples at the time have this kind of protection for the wives?
I don't know the other laws, because the most comparable law at this time would be Roman law.
Yeah.
And Roman law was very dependent upon the status of the woman, meaning if she came from a high-class noble background, then there was usually more protection in the law for her property than if she came from a lower-class background. But in general, Rome did not have as much protection for women in general or women's property on average. But I do think they did have some protection for more esteemed women from the proper classes.
Yeah.
But I had heard, and I haven't done enough follow-up research to say this for certainty, but I have heard from multiple sources that many women in the Roman Empire were very attracted to Judaism and converted to Judaism because they recognized in it that it was, in general, a more egalitarian form of protection than what they had in Rome. So, chapter 8, Mishnah 4.
Rabbi Shimon says, in respect to that in which the husband is at an advantage when he marries his wife, he is at a disadvantage when he divorces her. And in respect to that in which he is at a disadvantage when he marries her, he is at an advantage when he divorces her.
Okay. What?
What?
Don't worry. He's going to try to explain it. This is meant to be a simple way to remember it. And once you understand the point he's trying to make, it is fairly straightforward. But the basic way he's putting this, let me just make sure I get my focus right so I see the right line at the right time, is that he's saying when you're getting married, there are certain things that he has an advantage over, right? A certain thing where he gets a perk. But when it comes time to divorce her, that perk goes in the opposite direction, right? It becomes a disadvantage. And vice versa. There are certain things that when he gets married, he is at a disadvantage. But when it comes time to divorce her, then actually it's a perk that it goes the opposite way, more in his favor. So part A will give us an example of that.
Produce, which is attached to the ground, is the husband's when he marries his wife, and hers when he divorces her.
All right, so let's go back to our fruit on the tree example, right? Produce attached to the ground. So he is getting married to her, and when he gets married to her, bam, all of that fruit becomes his. All right, that's what we just learned in that last paragraph of the last Mishnah. It was hers a second ago, still on the tree, but as soon as they get married, bam, it becomes his. Well, hey, that's nice, right? That's a pretty good perk. He is at an advantage when he marries her vis-a-vis the fruit that is on the tree. However, when he divorces her, and they're coming up with like the divorce settlement and what belongs to her and what belongs to him and all of that, the fruit that's still on the tree, he can't touch, right? That does not remain his when they get divorced. So it's good for him when they get married, but it's not his when they go the other direction. Make sense?
He can delay giving her the gift to take the fruit, right?
I mean, can he be a jerk? Yes. Yes. Unfortunately, in multiple situations, the husband can choose to be bad and to be mean. But the Mishnah and the rabbis in general were very clear that a husband who has made up his mind to divorce his wife should carry through that divorce as promptly as is appropriate. Made up the mind, not just casually considering it. But if he definitely thinks he's going to divorce her, he shouldn't say, well, if I divorce her on Tuesday, I'll get more money, so I'll wait until Tuesday. If you've decided you really are going to divorce her, you do it ASAP. If you're just discussing it and thinking about it, then yes, you should continue to seek counseling and all of that. But once it's decided, go through with it. And in fact, there's still a big problem in many places with people who have divorced their wives, especially civilly, but refuse to do it Jewishly and refuse to give a get. In fact, there was a very controversial case just this week in Israel. I don't know if you saw that in the Israeli news. There was a man who had been refusing to give his wife a get, the religious divorce document, for 10 years. And the man's mother died. And the rabbis in Israel, the chief rabbi, said, we won't bury your mother until you give the document to your wife.
She had waited for 10 years.
So now I'm of two opinions on that. First of all, I think it's good that they forced him to finally do it, and he did. But I'm not sure that delaying the burial of his mother was the right lever to push to make that happen.
Tried everything else they could.
They hadn't. There are other ways that you can force the divorce, especially in Israel, where the civil law is on the side of the rabbinate doing what they like. I mean, I have my hands tied in this country. I can't throw a husband in jail. I can't put fines on a husband or garnish his wages until he pays his wife, or until he gives his wife a divorce. But in Israel, they can. And when they choose not to do that, and then choose to really mess with someone's burial who wasn't related. I mean, it wasn't his mother's fault, right? And it's not like, she's responsible for what her grown adult son is doing. That's problematic. And then, of course, there is an actual technical halakhic way that the state can completely annul the marriage completely without the husband's consent at all. It's called an uprooting of the original marriage. It's hafka'at kedushin. It's as though they'd never been married, and we're done.
You didn't have any siblings, did you?
I didn't read about that in the article. But yeah, it's like I said, I like that they were forcing him to do what he should have done 10 years ago. I'm not sure this was the right way to force it. So it does still remain a problem, and men 2,000 years ago and today can still be jerks, and so can women. It's an egalitarian world. People can be mean no matter what their gender is. Even non-binary can be mean. It's just one of those things that brings humans together. All right, so part B gives us the counterexample of what it's like when it is disadvantage and becomes advantage.
Produce that is detached from the ground is hers when she marries, but the husband's when she is divorced.
All right, but the produce that's already been detached and that is turned into value from that, the principle, right, from the land, it's already been now taken off those trees that she owns, and that is his dividend of her trees. Well, once it's been picked and now they're divorced, those picked fruits stay as his. Even though they came from her trees and would have been hers if they were still on the tree, they are his now. Now remember, before they get married, that picked fruit is not his, right? That's the disadvantage of marriage. That picked fruit is hers coming in. That can be converted to cash, used to buy land, and then he can enjoy the fruit afterwards, but he doesn't get to enjoy the initial fruit that she comes to the marriage with. But on the other end, once it's been picked, it's already his possession now as part of his dividend, and therefore it stays with him when they get divorced. So, Rabbi Shimon, it's not as crazy as it sounds. That if it's good when you get married, it's bad when you get divorced. If it's bad when you get married, it's good when you get divorced. It's not a crazy way to remember it. All right, chapter 8, number 5.
If she inherited old slaves or female slaves, they are to be sold, and land purchased with the proceeds, and the husband can enjoy the usufruct.
Right, the dividend.
The dividend.
Go ahead and read Rabbi Shimon's response.
Rabbi Shimon ben
Gamliel.
Gamliel says she need not sell them because they are the glory of her father's house.
Okay, so said it before, bears repeating. Slavery in the time of the Mishnah was not the same as the American chattel slavery during the horrible period of our nation's past. All right, so it still is no great honor. It is still no great thing that we would want to revive, but the slavery that was being done at this time was not as absolutely brutal and horrible as it is today. For example, the slave owner did not hold the life and death of a slave in their hand. If they injured them, they had to let them go free, etc., etc. There were many liberties within the institution of slavery in the ancient world. Again, doesn't mean that we wanted it to perpetuate, and it was mostly a stopgap measure as a form of semi-poverty legislation at a time when people could not more readily donate to support other humans, and so they took them on as slaves in order that they would be given room and board while having pre-donated their work, if you will. It's kind of like, imagine hiring yourself out for a salary, and you tell your boss, look, I'll just work for a place to live and stuff to eat. And I'll do that for the next 5, 10, 50 years because the economy is so bad. That was what slavery was like for the most part in the Jewish system in the ancient world. That being said, it ain't fun. And slaves could be bought and sold between different owners. Okay, we're good, not good, but we understand. At that time, it would not be uncommon for a woman coming from a household of middle class or higher, what we would call middle class or higher, to have a slave that was her attendant. Maybe she was the nanny. Maybe she was the wet nurse when the child was growing up. Maybe she has been the assistant to the family. Well, that, as we learned, I can't even remember which chapter it was in, might be the slaves that she was brought that are useful, and that's great. These people are useful to the household, so there's no issue. But what happens if it is an old slave? Or what happens if it is a female slave which was not considered as productive in the manual labor sort of way in the ancient world? Then the husband, he's not getting his dividend. He's not getting any use from the property that she has brought into the relationship. So we understand the issue here. So the solution was, just like with trees, sell them, buy property, and then he can enjoy the dividends, and she will retain the value of the land itself. Make sense? Good. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel objects, and he says this is different than trees, because whatever her family has given to her to go into her new life should not be looked upon as worthless, even if economically they are worth less than other types of servants. Instead, you should look at this and say, this is part of the honor of her family. Her family was able to send her with the wet nurse, which might have been a well-liked and respected member of the house. The family might be sending her, yes, with an old guy that has been there with her since the beginning, but this is somebody that was treasured in that household. And to just sell them because they're not doing enough, they're not worth enough, is poking your finger in the eye of your wife's parents. And so therefore, not a good idea. Make sense?
Like, is Gamliel saying they're basically like semi-family? I don't want to oversell the love of slaves. I mean, we're not talking that necessarily every slave was treated with the utmost love, respect, and care, and the fact that they were a slave was just kind of a minor little thing. No, there were people out there who absolutely saw their slaves as being primarily an economic investment and something that they would utilize. There were limits, of course, as I mentioned, of how they could be utilized, and you couldn't abuse them in any sense, but you still looked at them as being an investment. There were some that were mixed. So the question here is, you shouldn't just assume that an old slave is worth less just because their economic capacity is less. Instead, you should look at an old slave and say, this is somebody that was probably important in the household, or else they wouldn't have sent him on or her on to the new family. And so you need to give more consideration, not just to the slave, because that would be a little too modern thinking, but also to what this person means in the eyes of the family who is sending them with the newlywed. So it's complicated because the view of individual freedom and liberty was very different in the old days. Again, it wasn't chattel slavery, but it was no picnic. As we can see by the quick comparison in part 2. Carry on.
If she inherited old olive trees or vines, they must be sold and land purchased with proceeds, and the husband can enjoy the dividends. Rabbi Judah says she need not sell them because they are the glory of her eternal house.
Okay, so same thing, which is she's brought with her the ownership of this lovely hillside full of olive trees or vines. But let's face it, these olive trees, these vines are past their prime. Right? They're not producing much fruit anymore, or maybe they've stopped producing fruit altogether. So, if I was going to be a smart investor, I'd sell that land to whoever wanted to buy it, and I'd take that money and I'd put it someplace that's going to earn me some dividends. Right? I want my usufruct. And that would be the mercantile thing to do. This time, Rabbi Yehuda is saying, no, that land probably matters to the family. Whether it's productive or not, it matters to the family. And therefore, you can't just dispose of it as though it was a worthless piece of property.
And then the halacha goes by Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda.
That the consideration needs to be given, yes.
For both.
Yes, for both. That you have to have that level of, let's use the modern word, sensitivity.
And if not, they can overrule the husband if the husband doesn't have that.
If it comes, push comes to shove to the court, yes. Yeah. But it should be understood. Again, like we've said multiple times, there should be conversation, there should be a collaboration, it should be a team. But if push comes to shove, she can explain that these trees, these people are not disposable, that they matter to her and her family. All right, and part 3 gives us a little bit more of a broader statement.
He who spent money in connection with his wife's property, whether he spent much and consumed little, or spent little and consumed much, what he has spent, he has spent. What he has consumed, he has consumed.
Okay, so this is going to be a little bit here and a little bit there, but the general rule is you don't keep receipts when you're dealing with your wife's property. So let's imagine that we're talking about a vineyard, and the husband decides that he wants to put in a new irrigation system to make the vineyard more productive. Okay, but he doesn't get to take the bill for the irrigation system and apply it against the value of the land, right? Whatever he wanted to spend to improve the property, he's allowed to. And so too, while he's on the land, if he wants to eat the grapes, right, or do whatever, he's allowed to. He doesn't have to keep a bill of his use of the land.
So if they divorce, he cannot take from the land whatever he invests.
Exactly. When he divorces or when he dies, his children are not allowed to deduct, well, Dad put in a $5,000 sprinkler, so therefore, that $10,000 piece of land is really only worth $5,000, or you have to pay us back. That doesn't happen, right? You're not nickel and diming each other of how this works. And this, by the way, is also a general good rule of a good relationship. If you find yourself keeping track of who paid for the movies and who paid for dinner, and did it equal out, and at the end of the week, let's swap out our bank account money so that it comes even, there's generally something unhealthy about that relationship. It's fine if you're among friends, but if you're married, generally speaking, you probably shouldn't be keeping track of that level. Now, if you use one person's 401k because there is some crisis in the family because you have access to it but not the other person's or something, then yes, as we're going to see in part A, there may be reason why you need to equal this out again. But in general, you don't need to keep a bank account of that interaction between husband and wife.
Can he sell some of the land to buy a sprinkler system, or use some of a later inheritance to buy a sprinkler?
Not this land, no. And again, the other inheritance would go to new land, and then the interest would be used for it. Right. Okay. Excuse me. Let me just make sure that's not an emergency. It is not. It's just a nuisance. And part A.
If he spent but did not consume, he may take an oath as to how much he has spent and receive compensation.
All right. So if he really can say, and this is with a full-blown swearing, wrath of God kind of level of oath, I have never enjoyed anything. I've never eaten a grape from her property. If he can honestly say that, and that was put under the most strenuous of circumstances, then yes, then he can get back the value of any of the improvements he made to the land. right? If she has a condo in Hawaii, and he has never set foot in the condo, he has never enjoyed a penny of any of the rental she made off that condo, but he did spend $10,000 to put in a new kitchen in the condo, then when they get divorced, he is entitled to that $10,000 back, right? Because he never used it, never enjoyed it, never profited from it at all. But he has to be able to swear up and down 100% that he did not enjoy any benefit from any of the improvements that he made to her property.
Nothing. There's no need. It's zero.
It has to be zero.
No, it's not like the food. What is the minimum amount of food? Here it's really zero.
It's zero, right? He has to swear that he has not consumed any of it, right? He did not enjoy any benefit from this, from her property, but he did make this improvement to it. And then in the case of a divorce, yes, that can be reconciled. But that's a pretty high bar to go to. And of course, the sages consider taking an oath to be a very extreme circumstance. All right, 8-6. Okay, but before we start, I'm going to give a quick introduction. You can finish your notes then. All right, so we are moving into familiar and unfamiliar territory. It's familiar because we've talked about it quite a few times. It's unfamiliar because we don't do this anymore. Yibum, levirate marriage. If you're looking it up in English, levirate marriage. You've got a guy, and he is married to a girl, right? That's a dress, that triangle. All right, they're married, but unfortunately, he gets hit by a meteor. But the problem is they've got no kids, which means his estate, well, who's it going to go to, right? There's no one to inherit from him under his estate. But luckily,
To the wife.
no, the wife does not inherit because the land is passed father, son, in order to keep the tribal balances originally balanced.
Okay, but when the thing with the wife, if she died, it goes to the husband.
Yes.
Why here, if he died, cannot go to the wife?
That's a great question, because that's not the way the Torah describes the laws of inheritance. So yes, that we are left working out the halacha according to what the Torah told us. And the Torah says that the son inherits from the father unless there are no sons, and then the daughters do. And the wife doesn't inherit from her husband. So he has a brother. Good, says the Torah. The brother and the wife can marry, and they will produce a child. That's a child, because it's smaller, because I can't draw a baby. They will produce a child, and that child will be considered the dead man's son, and will inherit that estate. Now,
If he doesn't have any relative at all,
then he's just dead.
Can she stay with the estate?
I mean, if he has no for inheritance purposes, he doesn't have a father, he doesn't have an uncle, he doesn't have a cousin.
Nothing.
Nothing?
No one. Zero.
What are they on? What are they on Mars? I mean,
What happened? Hey, it was a war. Everyone was killed.
okay, so there is no.
Can she stay with the estate?
You know, I've never looked into that particular case of what happens. I mean, the assumption would be, as we'll see at other points, that she would stay in ownership only because she'd be the only one left around. But I would have to look into exactly what happens when truly there can be no one is found. Because for most of the modern world, for most of the ancient world, everyone was related to everyone by some degree in most of the villages or cities, right? I mean, if you and I lived in the same town, chances are at least our great-great-great-great-grandfathers were brothers.
Yeah, but after the rebellion for Cosmo, for example,
Mhm.
or those kind of rebellion that the Romans killed everyone else, there's high probability that maybe no one's there.
And Masada.
Well, Masada, there were plenty of other people related to the people on Masada who didn't go on Masada, right? Remember, those people didn't go up there with like no parents, no cousins, no other people in their family. They just went up there and killed themselves. So that there would have been other survivors. But yes, I mean, even with the Holocaust, when whole cities were wiped out, technically there were still other relatives. But if there was no one in the area which did happen at certain points, and this was a bit of an issue at the return from Babylon and also after other great catastrophes, often the land would simply be up for grabs. There would be no claim to the land. So I would have to look into it a little bit more carefully to see whether or not the wife could get first dibs on land if there was a Holocaust that wiped out everybody who might possibly be thought of as having a claim, and no one else would be available to take possession. But that's a great hypothetical that I don't have a quick answer to. So, according to the Torah, the brother marries the wife, they have a child. That child is considered to be the dead man's son. That way, the dead man is still alive, right? His line, his inheritance, that land continues in the family through that child as his, and therefore, again, the allocations remain fair, they remain distributed. We don't end up with a unnecessary accumulation of wealth in one direction or another. That was one of the Torah's main concerns when it came to settling the land, was that eventually the land might end up in the hands of only a few very powerful and very lucky people who had good years, and when other people had bad years, and then they were able to sort of gobble it up. And if you've got people dropping dead and no one to take their portion, or going to the brother instead, well, now the brother has a double portion beyond what he should have had. And that over a few generations, that creates a natural tendency to create larger and larger portions with fewer and fewer people. The Jubilee was also designed to reset all of this land every 50 years. But in the meantime, the laws of levirate marriage were there in order to prevent this unfair accumulation. And that meant that the moment he died, a relationship was established legally, if not physically, between the widow and the brother of the deceased. That's what we mean by levirate marriage. That's what we mean by yibum. We good?
No. What if the child is a girl?
If the child is a girl, then there are no sons, and she inherits from the father. So yes, that still works out. And if they already have a daughter, we don't do this either. So it's only if they are childless completely. Now, in the modern world, we don't do this. Right? Most of our communities in Europe haven't done this for like 500 to 1,000 years, give or take the community. And in the Middle East, some communities still did up until modern times, but it's not done in practice in contemporary Jewish communities. Instead, we do the other option, which is known as chalitza. Chalitza is where the brother says, no, I won't marry you. And the woman says, how dare you not build up your brother's name? There's a little bit of an involving sandal and a little bit of spitting that goes on. And then they are not going to have to get married to each other. So that's where we stand here. But just remember, as soon as he dies and a relationship binding them together that is similar to an engagement, a betrothal, begins the moment the brother dies without having any children. We're good? Good, because without that, this isn't going to make any sense. With that, it's still going to be hard. 8-6. Natan, I believe you're up. And a reminder, Natan is reading from a slightly different translation, so don't be surprised when it sounds a little different.
No, not only because of the accent.
Hey, according to you, the rest of us all have an accent.
Everyone has an accent.
Exactly right. Everyone speaks the way they speak, and no two people speak the same.
A woman awaiting the womb, to whom property fell, the Shammai and the Hillel agree that she sells and she gives away. It is valid.
Okay, so what happens in this timeline if between the moment her husband died and the moment she has officially married the brother-in-law, what happens if she comes into some money? Right? Does it count like she's married, in which case it would belong to the brother-in-law? Because after all, if the husband were still alive, he would get it in the ways that we discussed in the previous Mishnayot. Or does this count like the original betrothal we talked all the way back in 8:1, which to say she can do whatever she wants with it because they're not married yet? And the answer, both Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, the two major houses of thought, schools of thought in the ancient world before the Mishnah was finalized, they both agree that she can do whatever she wants during that gap between her death of her husband and the marriage, the official marriage to her brother-in-law.
It's very consistent with learned before, because
Mhm.
the brother is not the original one. So this is not the same status.
Exactly. She moves immediately into betrothal. But the status of Yibum, of being in this Levirate limbo, hey, that works, Levirate limbo, is a little different than just getting engaged. And so that's why they need to spell it out clearly. But you're right, the ruling does seem very consistent to what we've seen so far. The next portion.
If she died, what shall we do with her ketubah and with the property which comes in and goes out with her?
Okay, so here is the point where they're going to argue, which is, all right, her husband dies, she becomes bound to the brother-in-law, but she then dies before they can be married. Now what happens to her property, right? Does it go to her supposed to be betrothed brother-in-law? Does it go to her husband's family? Does it go to her original family? What happens with her property if she's not married, but she is betrothed through this Levirate bond? All right, we're all working on this wonderfully complicated scenario. And yes, this kind of thing would be very easy to happen. As the Tan mentioned, with wars and other types of attacks, it's very easy to imagine that her husband was killed on Monday and the army came back on Friday and then killed her.
I think disease is probably more likely.
It depends on different points of time.
Oh,
There were times when wars were very common and attacks and raids were unfortunately, a very persistent issue. And diseases as well, yes. And famine, starvation and that sort of thing could also take people. But usually if it's in such short order, it was either a virulent plague or it was someone with a sword. Okay, so what do both groups say?
The Shammai say, the heirs of the husband shall divide with the heirs of the father.
All right, so Beit Shammai says a little bit for you and a little bit for you, meaning the heirs of the husband, which would probably include the brother-in-law, would divide it along with her father's family, who would also receive it as well. Because technically, if she was absolutely single and she died, the money would go to her father's household. So basically, Beit Shammai says, this is really complicated, just divide it. That's his response to this particular issue. Make sense? It just seems fair that she is half married and half single, so half the money should go to the married side, half the money should go to the single side.
Yeah, but before that, they said clearly that it's not the same. The brother is not like the husband, so before that, it's not the same status in
Right.
everything go.
And
So I think it's has more weight, her family, than the future husband.
absolutely, if we go back to the normal betrothal, right, in her first marriage, she got engaged, and then she dies, her husband doesn't inherit anything. Everything would go back to her family because she never finished getting married. So that would be the argument against Beit Shammai. And Beit Hillel has its own explanation.
But the Hillel say properties remain with the possessors. Tuba in the possession of the heirs of the husband, property which comes in and goes out with her in the possession of the heirs of the father.
Okay, so what he's trying to say here is everyone just keeps what they have, right? So her property is her property, and therefore that property should stay with her family, meaning her father's household, right? Or any other heirs that might be to her. But the ketubah, meaning the money that she has a claim to as part of her ketubah, that is still with her dead husband's family. They should just keep that property. Her family can't claim the ketubah from them, right? So to summarize what Natan was saying, Beit Hillel basically agrees with you that the majority of it goes to her family. The only thing that is left in the possession of the dead man's family is they cancel the debt of the ketubah that her family might have tried to claim. That doesn't get settled. That just stays with the dead guy's family.
But why they want to claim a tuba that she already passed away? She's not divorcing, and she will not divorce in the future.
Well, no, because the ketubot are also paid upon death. Right? If a man dies, his wife gets the ketubah money. That's her inheritance automatically. Not technically. It's a loan, not a loan. It's a debt. But that money goes to her. If she dies without having collected her ketubah, her children are allowed to claim the ketubah from their father's estate. So the ketubah is it's more like a debt that is owed to her. And if she dies, that debt is inherited by whoever inherits her estate. Now, normally in a sort of routine situation, that would be her husband. And so the ketubah would circle back into where it already was. But here the question is, well, wait, shouldn't her brothers, if they're the surviving relatives, shouldn't they have a claim on the ketubah? And Beit Hillel's answer is no. Let people just keep what they've got. Right? The brothers take hold of all of her farms and whatever else might have been her property. And her husband's family, they just keep on holding whatever would have been used to pay off her ketubah, and they don't have to settle that up. Make sense? Okay. Yeah, it's complicated. And I think you could imagine the shouting matches that might have happened if there wasn't halakha to settle this up. Looking at the clock. You know what? I think we can make 8. You know what? If we're quick about it, we can maybe even finish chapter 8. Maybe. Let's do 8-7 at least. We'll see how we get. I'm game if you are. Unless you guys are all burnt out and want to just call it a night. You're still okay? Okay.
Okay. Mishnah 7. If his brother left money, land should be bought with it. He enjoys the use of it.
Okay. So if there was money left by the dead guy, then the money is turned into land, and the fruit, the dividend, which I'm just going to call fruit, goes to the new brother-in-law husband. But the actual land will eventually belong to the kid.
But you are admitting that she's the one that inherits the land. Because that
no.
happened when she's inherited the land.
No, but this is money that belonged to the dead man, not to the woman. So the money belonging to the dead man should go to the child, but no child exists yet. So what's being done is the money's being turned into land, waiting for the child. But in the meantime, because it's part of the family, the new husband is allowed to enjoy the dividend.
Are all the kids from the Love Right marriage, do all the kids belong to the dead husband?
Just the first.
Just the first.
Quick question.
No quick answers.
I'll try. So if the husband has a brother, but the brother's too young to marry, does she have to wait and marry the brother when he's like of age?
Classically, yes. For much of our history, no. Exactly. Judah and Tamar in the story of Judah that comes in the book of Genesis is the most classic example of this, where Judah had 3 sons, and the first one was married to a woman named Tamar, and then he died. And then the second one got married to her, and he died. And so the third one was too young, and so Judah said, well, you'll just have to wait. But even when he was old enough, he still didn't want to give the third one to this woman who had already become widowed to 2 of his other sons. And it's a wonderful story. Read it. It's got a great ending and a great strong heroine. But yes, technically in the classic world, you would just wait as long as the child had been born. You wouldn't wait for your husband's parents to have a new kid to grow up and marry you. But if there was one, then you would wait. Again, classically, but most of the time, if the child was too young, they just did the separation of chalitza.
Sorry, one thing.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Since you have 2 dead brothers, and if the third one marries,
Yep.
Whose kid is the third one?
You know, I don't remember that off the top of my head. That's a really good question of whether or not the child is considered to be the child of the first brother or of the second one. I'd have to look that up. Sorry. Yeah.
And what happened?
Well, no, because it would still be levirate marriage.
But in that situation, if I was the new husband, I would not have any son. So I'm sure that at the end, everything would go to me.
What are you going to do with it? I mean, if you don't want to have any children,
Yeah. So,
but it would still go to your daughters. If you only have daughters, your daughters inherit.
No, but in that situation, okay,
Mhm.
the land will go to the future child of both of them from the former husband that passed
Oh,
away.
yes,
But
yes.
if I don't have any child with her,
Oh.
okay, so the land at the end, if she died, will go at the land to my family
So,
and to my
The
children.
book of so in the book of Genesis, Bereshit, with Tamar, that was exactly the thought of the second brother, right? Onan, right? He spilt his seed, to use the delicate expression. He refused to get her pregnant. Precisely because he didn't want any of it to go to his brother, his dead brother's children, and God killed him for that. So because he was a jealous, greedy jerk.
But you say that people are sure.
They are.
It's still history.
Of
So
course.
what's happened in that situation? In that situation,
There was no
the land goes
So,
to him.
in that situation, for most of our history, if he was really going to be that jealous and greedy, then we would do chalitza and she wouldn't have to marry him at all. Because if he doesn't want to build up the name, then why would he want to marry the dead woman, the
But
dead
what
boys?
happened, he said, yeah, they married and nothing happened. After 2, 3, 4 years, can the court say? Can she go to the court and say,
If she has
he's doing this,
yeah.
this, can you divorce him?
If she has evidence that he is deliberately either not being with her intimate or is doing things while intimate to prevent there from being pregnancy, then yes, she has the grounds to go to the court.
And she received also the Ketubot.
Well, yes, but it would depend also. I mean, what the court did, they may not force a divorce. They may try to coerce him into doing his duty first, because the court has an obligation to the dead man as well.
And what if he cannot have children?
So if there's a question of like full infertility and all of that, then usually you would just do chalitza and you would separate him from her and they would each go their own way. Right? If that's a known issue. Again, they didn't always know about infertility so much, exactly what was causing it in the ancient world, but nowadays we know better. Okay.
If not, it's divorce. If they already married and they are both infertile, they need to divorce and
it's a little more complicated than automatic, but yes, it would be a question. She would receive the ketubah in that case if there was a divorce for those grounds.
And the land will go to her family.
Her own property, you mean?
The property from the former husband that passed away.
No, she didn't inherit from him.
It goes to
It would go back to him. Or it would go back to the dead husband's family. It wouldn't go to his wife. She doesn't inherit from him.
So go to
It would go to the other family. Yeah.
the other family.
Yeah. Okay, onward. Honest, we're going to get more than one
I
sentence.
don't know if they have a misprint here or I'm not reading it right. If be his brother.
Oh, yeah, if his brother.
Okay.
They probably originally typed if the brother, but yeah, it should be if his brother.
If his brother left produce that was detached from the ground, land should be bought out of the proceeds. He enjoys the use of it.
All right, so just as we talked about before, but now we're talking about the deceased's property, not the wife's property. If, erase my beautiful trees. If all of the fruit has already been taken from the trees, it's been detached, then you turn it into cash, you liquidate it, you buy land, and then you get dividends from it, but the value of the land remains for the eventual child. Good. But if it's attached to the ground, the apples are still on the tree.
Rather, right here says the land is to be valued as to how much it's worth with produce and how much without the produce. And with the different land, it should be bought.
And with the difference,
With the difference,
land should be bought.
and the husband is entitled to the use of it.
Exactly. So again, Rabbi Meir is consistent with what he said about the woman, which was if it's still on the tree, you just find out what the difference is with it, without it, and that is used to buy land. The sages are going to disagree. They're going to pull back and say the same thing they said before.
The sages say, produce attached to the ground belongs to the husband, but that which is detached from the ground belongs to the first person who takes it. If he seized it, he first acquires ownership, and if she seized it, first land should be bought with it, and then he enjoys the use of it.
All right. So this gets a little different because she is now a, what do you call it? An equal claimant to what is attached to the tree. So you've got this vineyard and all these grapes are on it. The first husband dies, and they get married. Well, sorry, not before they get married. who owns the fruit on the vine? Whoever gets there first. Whoever gets there first. Between the husband, between the new husband, between the widow, right? If she goes out and she gathers all the grapes, they're hers. If he goes out and gathers all the grapes, they're his.
So can you hire?
It's a race.
Can you
Of
hire
course.
workers?
Yeah.
But that's the disadvantage for her because women usually don't have the resources, economic resources to hire people. And yes, the other
She can get her family to help out. I mean, so it's not a question of advantage, disadvantage. It's a question of no one has a superior claim. Therefore, in whomever's hands it is, has the right to hold on to it because no one else can prove that they shouldn't be holding it.
Usually the woman went to the husband family with the land.
It is definitely
So
possible.
she doesn't have any
She can
family
get her
left.
friends. She can get whatever. I mean, she gets the sewing circle together and they all go out and harvest one night. I mean, it's not a question of who is it fair for, who is it not fair for. It's a question of there is no fair or unfair because neither one has the superior claim that can make it definitely theirs. So it's first come, first serve.
But she is in disadvantage. She's grieving for her husband, and the brother say, "Oh, this is my chance."
Again, this isn't about who's nice and who isn't nice. This is about what happens when it comes to the court. And the court would have to say, he's got the wagon full, he's got it, it's his.
But indirectly, it's an advantage for the men.
I think we can agree that in many of the economic situations of the ancient world, whether it was directly or indirectly, the man was often at an advantage, yes. And again, that isn't saying that that was the ideal, but that was the de facto result of what the ancient world looked like. Again, it doesn't mean we have to duplicate it in the modern world. A little bit more.
So if he married her, she is his wife in every respect, save that her ketubot remains a debt on her first husband's estate.
All right, so in case you're wondering, once they get married, are they really married? And the answer is yes, they are really married, but she still gets to claim her ketubah against the estate of her first husband, the dead man.
And what happens if she tried to improve the ketubah with the second one?
So there isn't an opportunity for creating a different tanaim, different conditions, because it's an obligation for both of them, if everything works out, for them to get together to have that child. So she doesn't get to renegotiate a new ketubah. Because her duty and her brother-in-law's duty is to the deceased. And since she already has her first ketubah from her first husband, it's not like she is missing out. She got the first ketubah.
Yeah, but the obligation duty with the deceased for the first son. But they will continue being married after having the first son. And that she doesn't have any opportunity to renegotiate the ketubah.
But she also, how do you renegotiate with someone when you're under an obligation for your brother? I mean, that for both directions.
You can see that tonight. Okay, this is the price
No.
that the ketubah, if something happened before or up to the first son. After that, this is the
No.
ketubah.
I know what you could say, but let's imagine you're the wife and I'm the brother-in-law, right? So we need to get married to have a child in honor of my brother so that he can do it. And that is a mitzvah for me. The Torah commands me to do this. So you turn to me and say, oh, the Torah commands you to do this. Let me tell you what I want, right? I want this, I want that, I want the other. What am I supposed to do? Say, no, I won't do the mitzvah. I won't honor my brother's name. You have me over a barrel.
So do the condition.
So do what you're saying.
No. But after the kids, that's okay. We can divorce.
But that had to
or
be agreed.
recognition.
But that has to be agreed before we get married. But before we get married, I'm not able to choose not to marry you if I want to honor my obligation to my
So
brother.
you cannot add any condition.
I'm not saying it couldn't be done. I'm saying it doesn't need to be done. Right? Of course, it could be done. If you can write whatever you want, and as long as both people agree to it, that's fine. But if you're able to twist my arm, then you can't force me to do that. No, you can't force me to do it. You can convince me, sure. Maybe you're wonderful and lovely and I want to do everything I can for you, but you can't force me to do it.
I thought she had no right to refuse a love right marriage.
Not exactly, no. So we'll study Yibum in full detail some other time, but let's just finish off 8.8. Because, yeah, the laws of levirate marriage are incredibly complicated, and there's a reason we don't do it anymore. Well, there's lots of reasons we don't do it anymore. 8.8.
8:8.
Yeah. Well, we just finished 8.7, didn't we? Yeah. We're on 8.8, the end of chapter 8.
He cannot say to her, "Behold, your ketubah lies on the table." Rather, all of his property has on it a lien from her ketubah.
Okay, so in general, the lien for the ketubah, the debt of the ketubah, is collected first and foremost from actual land, from property. Possessions are not usually used to pay off the ketubah, right? It's the land that is considered stable, that is considered reliable, that is considered a safe investment.
Diamond and gold.
Again, it's not considered the standard place you pay. Now, you may liquidate your land and then turn it into cash. That's fine, but it's the land that has the inherent value that was considered to be solid, right? It was the gold standard of value in the ancient world, which means that I can't, if I'm the husband, in this case, we're also talking about the yibum, I can't say, here's a bag of gold, that's yours for the ketubah, right? You can't have it yet, but that covers her ketubah. And that means I can do whatever I want with the dead man's property, right? Because remember, her ketubah is secured by her dead husband's property. The brother can't come in and say, look, this is enough to cover your ketubah, but I want to sell the vineyard because I've got a buyer for it. So don't worry about it. Your money's in the bag, but I want to sell the vineyard. The court says, no, absolutely not. You're not allowed to say that because the land is the solid value that will pay for her ketubah. You're not allowed to give her one thing or promise her one thing and then free up all the other property, right? The property is all under obligation until the ketubah has been settled.
She agreed.
Well, so as always, if things can be,
She agrees.
right. But again, it can't be an agreement under duress. It can't be an agreement under exploitation. It would have to be a legitimate agreement, and maybe even with additional, sure, you can sell the vineyard. I'll let you have permission to do that, but I want 10% of the sale. You know, that kind of negotiation where she gets more of a position of power, that could certainly be work. But if the court says, you forced her to accept this, right? That's not fair, right? You told her that you would delay it or that you wouldn't agree to this or that you would never let her do what. You can't exploit a person in that position, right? The property remains available as the debt or as the credit against the debt that will pay off her ketubah.
And if you live in the city and you don't have a land,
You have to, where are you living?
no, you can live in a town and you can have another profession. And
You don't own your house?
He rented.
So the idea of like living without any ownership of any
So you say
property.
land could be also the house and that's it.
Well, exactly. So yes, as time went on, Jewish law has had to adapt. But the Mishnah is definitely talking about a time where everyone would have owned some piece of land, that was what they were living on and what they were eating from. For just about everybody in society, that was the standard.
But if you are a slave, you are not owner of the land.
If you are a slave, you don't have a ketubah with your wife, because chances are your wife is also the property of your owner. So it's not the same kind of relationship, which is a whole nother conversation and also very painful. Okay, but we're going to finish up. So too,
a man may not say to his wife, "Behold, your ketubah lies on the table," but all of his property has on it a lien from her ketubah.
right? Same thing. Even when they're married, forget about the whole death thing. Just two normal people. He can't say to her, I'm going to go sell this, even though we're getting divorced, because here that's enough to cover your ketubah. Until the ketubah has been paid, she has a claim against all of his property, all of his real estate. Make sense? Okay. And then A.
If he divorced her, she is entitled only to her ketubah.
Okay. And
if he remarried her, she is like all of the wives and is entitled only to her ketubah.
Right? So if you divorce, right, then you can pay off the ketubah as well, and sell the rest of the property. But if he remarries her, right, then the Levirate form, right? If he divorces her, but then remarries her not as a Levirate wife, but as a regular wife, then she is entitled to her ketubah as well. But the new ketubah based on the new marriage. Again,
And what about the previous one?
she already would have been given that if she had been divorced in the first place. But that first divorce would have come from her dead husband's first estate, or the estate of her first dead husband. Hopefully she only has one dead husband, but the ancient world was rough. Okay, whew, made it.
No, it wasn't pretty egalitarian for the time.
For the time, it was
Yeah.
extremely egalitarian. For contemporary halakha, we do handle things differently. In modern situations, divorces are all handled according to whatever the courts decide, and that is a condition in modern marriages that everybody agrees that the ultimate allocation of property after a divorce or in death will be handled according to customs of local standards.
So which excuses can you use to wedding? Like you say that because of Israel.
So when someone, the short answer, right?
Yeah.
So because it's a long topic, but hafka'at kiddushin, the uprooting of kiddushin, is based off the fact that when someone gets married, they present their beloved with the ring, and they say, hare'at, right? Behold, you are consecrated to me, kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the laws of Moses and Israel. And Israel, say the rabbis in the Talmud, that's us, that's the sages. And if you get married according to the laws of Israel, then if Israel says you're not married, you were never married. Right? It is the nuclear option within the Talmud where they discuss this idea that whatever the rabbis create, the rabbis can undo. Whatever the sages sanction, the sages can choose to unsanction.
And it's accepted and used by also the Orthodox world.
No, because we thought of it first.
And the conservative.
The conservative movement, when we were dealing with this issue in the 20th century, said, look, there's this discussion of this hafka'at kiddushin in the Talmud, and they describe exactly what it is, and the Tosafot describe what it would do, and how this would be, what the implications would be. There's even a discussion of, well, wait a minute, this would allow us to avoid mamzerim and everything else as well, because then you can say it wasn't really adultery. And we said, okay, well, we're not going to use this a lot. We have a very strict baked-in policy where we have to prove that the husband will never or can never give a get, for example, in a coma, has gone mentally insane, or other issues as well, or is simply missing and we can't presume the person is dead, then we will use it in certain circumstances. But the burden of evidence is very high. And it works because it fits halakha, it fits the Jewish tradition, but there was no Masorah, there was no tradition of using it. We always found other ways to force a divorce when necessary because we had other levers. We could say no one will do business with this guy until he does it, and try to live in a village if you can't buy from the butcher, if you can't buy from the grocer, then you're going to change your mind real fast about giving your wife a proper divorce. But in the Orthodox world, they have been very reluctant to do it, partly because they are reluctant to do anything that is novel, even if it is established in the Talmud, and partly because the suggestion for doing it came from our movement, and that makes it suspect on the surface. One of the rabbis I studied with, who was on the Beit Din that would handle these cases, said that he has talked with Orthodox colleagues, and they said, we wish you hadn't done this first, right? Because you did it first, we can't copy you, or it'll look like we're being too liberal. But we would have liked, now that we look at this and see the situation and recognize that we don't have as much leverage in the modern world as we used to, we wish we had the ability to use this to help women in these situations. But to do it now would look like we're giving in. And so they refuse to do it.
Rabbi.
Yes.
8:7, when it talks about the brother being able to just keep the state for